Hello there. Let's do some practice questions for the CompTIA A Core 1 exam with my explanations and reasonings for these questions I've put together. But first, a quick disclaimer for this video. Darkbird Tech, this channel of mine, is not affiliated with CompTIA or any of their partners. These questions that I put together are meant to give you a practice in preparing for the exam. These are not actual exam questions and answers. That would be a violation of the NDA that we agreed to when we start a CompTIA exam and a violation of CompTIA's unauthorized preparation material. All of these questions have been put together to provide a similar experience to what you might see in the exam and how the knowledge can be tested. Any similarities is because of this design intent. Now, in terms of how we are going to work through this video, we are going to have the questions appearing on the screen. We'll obviously have a look at the question. Then the options will appear. For some of the questions, I will give you opportunities to pause the video to think about the options you'd like to see. But obviously for some questions, you actually need to see the options because there could be any number of answers. Then we will have a look at those options and we will work out what the correct answer is. And once we've done that, we can take a sip of coffee. Another area where the exam similarity ends. Sadly, you can't drink coffee while you're doing the exam. Anyway, alright, first question. A regional manager's phone is not pairing with their car's hands-free kit. The car shows Bluetooth is connected, but on their phone, it lists the car kit as not connected. Which of the following should the technician do? Now, I'm going to give you a chance to think about the options you want to see. Pause the video if you want to. But our options are reboot the phone, turn off the Wi-Fi, repair the devices, or enable Bluetooth. Now, this is a troubleshooting question and one of two types you will see in the A+ exam. This type, it's saying, hey, here's a problem, what could you do next on a technical level. You'll also get some types of questions where they're asking you, where are you in the troubleshooting model? So sometimes it'll be a case of that troubleshooting model we spoke about in the first module, or it'll be an actual technical thing that you would have to figure out from the knowledge you gain from the other modules I covered. Now, one of the things that helps a lot with the troubleshooting questions especially, but also all questions in general, is a process of elimination. Now, rebooting a phone is a viable option in a lot of troubleshooting scenarios when it comes to trying to figure out what's going on with the phone, because sometimes it just does a memory clear, reloads the OS and all the apps, and then suddenly everything's behaving itself nicely. So that is an option, but I wouldn't want to jump to that straight away because we've got very specific symptoms here. Bluetooth not being connected. Turning off the Wi-Fi, that might do something, but I doubt it. This is a Bluetooth problem, not a Wi-Fi problem, so I'm not too keen on that. Repairing the devices, this is something that you could look at doing, and it can be a bit quicker than rebooting the phone. So this is worth considering. And then enabling Bluetooth. Now, knee-jerk reaction a lot of you might be having is, well, that's a good option because one of the first bits of advice you get for troubleshooting is always check the thing is turned on, check the thing is plugged in. In this case, it's a wireless technology, so there's nothing to check for plugging in. But the Bluetooth is appearing on the car, and you don't get any pair listings at all on your phone if the Bluetooth is off. And it says there that the phone is currently showing it as not connected. So that means it is on. So I don't think that's a good option. I would say let's try repairing the devices. This is a very common thing you encounter with Bluetooth devices where sometimes they just get some sort of weird block, some sort of miscommunication in the Bluetooth profiles. And all you need to do is just forget the device and then redo the pairing, agree to whatever needs to be exchanged or allowed, and then it usually behaves itself perfectly fine. I myself have to do this once in a while with my car kit. So I'm going to go with repairing the devices as a specific next step for this particular scenario. If we didn't have that sentence though that said that the phone is showing the car kit as not connected, then I'd be tempted to say let's check that the Bluetooth is turned on. That would be a good option. Otherwise though, that should do for that question. Next question. Which of the following DNS record types deals with emails? So I'll give you a moment to think about the options you'd like to see. Hopefully the one you're thinking about is going to appear, and if that does happen when you're in the exam, that's fantastic. You go with that. Trust your knowledge. But let's see the options anyway. And the options are quadruple A, TXT records, CNAME records, and MX records. Quadruple A records are for IPv6 hosts. That's not an email thing. Any system can have a quadruple A record if it's rocking IPv6. TXT records, they were originally a form of leaving notes for yourself as an administrator, and now it's used by things like SPF, DKIM, DMARC, etc. But that is email related, but it's for email security. So you might be tempted to go with that, especially if you remember that from the security topics. But it's not dealing with emails directly, it's dealing with the security of the emails. The CNAME or canonical name records, they act as a pointer record. So domain A pointing to domain A1.com. That's what CNAME records do. They allow for multiple names to be resolving to and pointing to just one common domain name. For example, if you go onto the internet and type in www.comptia.com, it will redirect you to www.comptia.org, because at the moment CompTIA is at a .org domain. So you could have a CNAME record pointing at an email record, but that's a bit of a stretch. So no. The question says, which DNS record deals with emails? And that leaves us with MX, or the mail exchange record. The mail exchange record is the type of record you want to publish about your email server on a publicly accessible and authoritative DNS server. And the reason why is, as the sender of an email going to you and your organization, I don't care what email protocols your email server relies upon. I just want to know that I am beginning a session with the correct server. So one MX record can handle quite a few different types of email protocols, and that deals directly with emails, making that the better choice compared to the TXT record, which you have to argue 2 or 3 steps to justify it as an email. And not every organization out there is using SPF, DKIM, and DMARC to keep their mail stuff secure. So don't stretch the answer. If you've got a direct answer, go with that. Our next question. A technician is troubleshooting a server that goes offline and loses data during power outages. Well, that's not too surprising. Computers need electricity to work. The server is plugged into a UPS. Okay, now this is getting interesting. What should the technician consider doing to resolve this issue? So the options are: replace the UPS batteries, replace the RAM, replace the CMOS battery, or run a firmware update. So I'll give you a moment to think about which option you would consider doing. But I'm straight away attracted to the first option, replacing the UPS batteries. Batteries don't last forever. Doesn't matter how well you care for the batteries, utilize them, charge them, discharge them, etc. Batteries inevitably stop holding significant charge. In fact, they can get to the point where they're not really holding any charge at all. And if the server is already plugged into a UPS, well, that means that it should be kicking in straight away when there's no power. So the batteries probably need to be replaced or upgraded. Now, why isn't it any of the other options? Well, replacing RAM's not going to do anything. RAM is volatile storage, meaning that if there's no power, the data is lost. Doesn't matter whether it's a laptop, a desktop, or a server. If the computer loses power, the data in RAM is gone. That's why so much of our software does auto-saving nowadays to minimize on that data loss that could happen if the computer completely loses energy. So changing the RAM is not going to do much good. And it's a server. It's going to be very expensive. So not a good option. Replacing the CMOS battery, that could be a viable option if the problem was the computer is booting up with the incorrect date and time settings, or any custom or non-default firmware settings are not being maintained when the computer is unplugged from power. That's what the CMOS battery maintains in firmware, is the hardware clock, or the real-time clock as it's called, and any settings that can't be stored permanently in the firmware chips. But that would be a problem for any computer, whether it be a laptop server or desktop. Here, we're talking about a server that goes offline and loses data during power outages. Not necessarily settings, we're talking data. So, and they did mention specifically a UPS. A firmware update, never a bad thing to look at doing, as just regular good maintenance. Updates and upgrades are a good thing to always be on top of. But it wouldn't make a difference to the system's power state, because losing power is a physical hardware thing. So firmware is not really going to help us, despite that being a hardware component. Remember, your firmware is built into your hardware. It is part of your hardware. The batteries needing to be replaced in the UPS is the most likely thing. How long you go between UPS battery replacements? Well, that depends on a whole bunch of variables, usually based on the discharge cycles. Otherwise, though, that's the answer to that question. So let's move on to another one. Next up, a user is complaining that their computer takes too long to boot up and load applications. Which of the following upgrades would best address these complaints? I'll give you a chance to think about the options you'd like to see, but it's probably going to be a hardware bunch of options given the question. Pause the video if you want to. But our options are upgrading the CPU, upgrading the RAM, upgrading either to or to a better SSD, or upgrading the network card. Now, in terms of what would most affect boot time and app load time, the CPU would help, the RAM would help, but to upgrade either would also probably require a motherboard upgrade, and there I'm talking a desktop. They don't specify that this is a laptop or a desktop. If it's a laptop, I'm afraid there's not much you can do apart from upgrade the whole laptop. The SSD, however, that can make a big difference. The thing about storage is it can be a performance bottleneck, and especially when you are looking at loading something from your storage into RAM. That's the operating system and the applications. An SSD can help improve those types of load times. So I'm feeling very good for the SSD. The network card, it could make an improvement, but that would only work if we were using virtual desktop infrastructure, where the user has a very lightweight client, we call it a thin client, and they're relying on a VM running on a server that actually is their computing environment, and their thin client connects them to that VM through the network. But now we're stretching it, and you want to be careful about stretching a good answer, especially when there are more suitable answers that don't require a specific scenario for it to work. And you've got to be careful on the A+ exams, actually any CompTIA exam, because you can sit with a lot of questions and the options they give you and argue that every one of them is right given the correct circumstances. And you don't want to do that to yourself, because then you're going to start double guessing yourself, making mistakes, running out of time. Go for the most direct, the most straightforward, the most appropriate answer for the given question. So the network card's definitely out. CPU definitely helps improve performance, but only once stuff is in memory. So I'll give that half a mark as an answer. RAM, having more memory can help because you can have more data open, more applications open, more things just in the computer's workspace ready to be used. But unless you're going from one generation of RAM, like for example from DDR3 to DDR4 or to DDR5, you're not going to see an improvement in how fast things can be put in RAM until you do that generational improvement. An SSD, however, you could stick that into an old computer as long as it takes a SATA connector and you're good to go. So this would probably be the best way to improve this person's issues and complaints. So I'm going to go with the SSD. If the SSD were not helping the person, so like if, for example, we did that and then it doesn't seem to help, then I will look at something else. I'll try and figure out what the next bottleneck is. But this question doesn't ask you what would you do next, what would you do next, what would you do next. It's asking you what are you going to do now. So I'm happy with that answer. Next up, which of the following tools is used when installing a patch panel? Now, just as a reminder, a patch panel is something that's used in network cabinets and server racks to make cable management a lot easier. So this is a networking and hardware level networking question. So think about the options you'd like to see, about the tool that you would use to work with a patch panel. And the options they've given us: a toner probe, a crimper, a tap or a test access point, or a punch down tool. Now, in terms of, but why is a screwdriver not listed? Yeah, you would need a screwdriver probably to mount the thing and unmount it and all of that, but it's not a given option. Work with the given options they have here. And if the one you were thinking of doesn't appear, okay, next best. So let's see. Toner probe. You'd use that if you're trying to track and trace a cable, but we're dealing with a patch panel that we are installing. You would use a toner probe on something that has already been installed, badly labeled, badly documented, and you're trying to track and trace cables. So not a good option. It might be something you need, but not when you're doing a new patch panel. A crimper. A crimper is part of your networking toolkit, but when you're terminating RJ45 connectors on network cables. The patch panel itself doesn't have RJ45 connectors as part of its construction. We plug cables with RJ45 connectors into the patch panel. And they're talking about installing the patch panel, not connecting to it. A test access point? No, this is completely unrelated to installing a patch panel. The punch down tool? That's the answer. The punch down tool is the thing that you're going to use to push the individual wires that make up a twisted pair network cable into the little slots on the backside of a patch panel all-wall connector. So that's the correct tool to be using here. Yeah, you might use a crimper then to do the cables you're going to plug into the patch panel, and you might need a toner probe to track and trace if labeling has not been done properly, but you'd more likely have to deal with incorrect labeling on an existing installation, not a new one. So the punch down tool is the better answer here. Not to say you wouldn't have the other three tools nearby, but it's the one you're going to definitely be using to install the cables into the patch panel. Next, an organization needs to be able to print in color, and they want a printer that will offer the lowest overall TCO. Which type of printer would be the best option? Now, while you're thinking about the types of printers you'd like to see here, also keep in mind what TCO is. Total cost of ownership. Total cost of ownership has two parts to it: the initial purchase price and ongoing costs. Ongoing costs would be the consumables the printer needs, maintenance, repairs, stuff like that. So TCO is looking at not just, which is the most expensive or the cheapest printer to buy, but also which one is going to offer you the lowest overall long-term costs for the lifetime of this device or appliance. Dare I say asset. So the printers they have for us are thermal printers, laser printers, inkjet printers, and 3D printers. Now, straight away, we can eliminate a thermal printer. Now, if you're saying, but wait a minute, you said to us thermal printers are one of the lowest total cost of ownership printers you can have. Yes, I know I said that in one of my printing videos, but thermal printers don't do color. So that knocks thermal printers out of the equation, despite being the lowest TCO. That leaves us with laser, inkjet, and 3D printers. Now, 3D printers, first of all, are expensive. Straight away out of the bat. You have to buy a plastic filament, and they need heat to melt that plastic, so the electrical costs are kind of substantial for a 3D printer. At least in terms of being a printer. But yeah, you could print any 3D item in whatever color you like. But usually when we're talking about printers in A+, we're not looking at 3D printers, we're normally looking at office printers. Think about it this way. If you walked into the average person's home or the average business's office space, you are more likely to see a paper printer than a 3D printer. Despite how many of your favorite content creators on YouTube probably showcase things they've done with a 3D printer. So that leaves us with laser and inkjet. Now, inkjet is cheap to buy, but expensive to run. Laser, expensive to buy, but cheap to run per page. It's the refills that are quite expensive that puts people off a little bit with laser printers. But remember, we're talking about an organization here, not an individual home user. So when you're spending company money, a laser printer makes more sense. In an office space, you're likely to have a lot of printing done very, very often, whether it be color or black and white. And the cost per page for a laser printer is tiny. Add to that as well, laser printers can also print pretty quickly, so if you're printing a lengthy document, it won't take as long on a laser printer as it would an inkjet, which means the next person who needs to print doesn't have to wait as long for you to be done. So a laser printer makes more sense, even with color printing. Inkjet is sort of okay in the home environment, but not viable in the workplace. So we'll go with laser printers. Next up, which of the following port numbers are associated with remote administration? Choose 2. Now this is an interesting little example because in CompTIA exams and some other certification vendors as well, you often get questions where you have to choose more than one option. Now CompTIA is pretty cool because what they do at the end of the question is they tell you choose 2, choose 3, choose however many you need to pick. So at least you know you're looking for 2 options here. So if you're looking at 3 options, one of them can't be right. One of them is either a red herring or you are mistakenly recognizing something for what it isn't. So let's have a look at the options. We've got the port numbers themselves. So I'm hoping you've studied your port numbers. Otherwise, I'll let you pause the video now and try and remember which ones are which. So let's work through them. Port 20 is one of the 2 ports used for FTP, the File Transfer Protocol. That's a service for moving files back and forth between an FTP server and a client that supports FTP. Very old protocol, very slow, very robust and reliable, hence why it still sticks with us to this day. Port 22, that is Secure Shell. Secure Shell is an encrypted remote command line administration protocol. Remote administration. Then we've got port 23, that is Telnet. An unencrypted remote command line administration protocol. Remote administration. Port 25, that is SMTP, the outgoing email protocol. Not really used to administrate a machine, maybe administrate people if it's your boss emailing you an instruction, but again, I'm stretching and making up weird scenarios to justify an incorrect answer. Don't do that. Port 53, that is DNS. And port 80, I'm hoping that one at least you recognized, is HTTP, the protocol that usually delivers the web page you see when you're browsing the internet. Now, yes, technically you can use HTTP to administrate some devices, but that's only if that operating system, service, or device actually supports HTTP-based administration, and even then I would rather be doing HTTPS forms of administration. 22 and 23. SSH and Telnet. Those are our answers here because those are from the very beginning of any description, any entry in a textbook, whatever, will tell you these are remote administration protocols. Both command line, one has encryption, one doesn't. But the question isn't asking you about which is more secure. It's just saying which one deals with remote admin. So 22 and 23. Now, before we move on from this question, I do want to give you one extra tip with something like this. I put these port numbers in numerical order. The exam might jumble them up, which you might be sitting there thinking right now, okay, so what? When you're in the exam and the port numbers are jumbled around and not in numerical order, it adds an extra layer of difficulty that you don't appreciate until you're sitting in the exam. So just be prepared for something like that. Next up, which of the following network devices are needed to implement VLANs? So a networking question and a topic that I kind of wish CompTIA didn't put in the new A+ objectives, but hey, I don't get to decide things. So you can expect questions about VLANs. So let's see what the options are. A managed switch, an unmanaged switch, a router, and a wireless access point. Now straight off the bat, I'm eliminating an unmanaged switch. When it comes to working with VLANs, you need to be able to log into the switch, enable the VLAN ID numbers you want to use, map them to port, set up the trunk links, all that cool stuff that I glazed over in my A+ videos, and I go into greater depth in my Network Plus videos on VLANs. But you need to be able to log in and configure stuff. An unmanaged or dumb switch, as some people call them, you cable it up, it learns MAC addresses, it makes forwarding decisions based on MAC addresses, but it doesn't have much of the other switch capabilities that you learn a little bit about in A+, and you learn more about in Network Plus. So unmanaged switch out of the equation, despite you maybe assuming VLANs and switches go together. And yes, they do, which means that managed switches are a pretty strong contender and is also the right answer. But do you need a router? A router does get involved because you might need to route from VLAN 10 to VLAN 20, but that's not a thing you need directly for VLANs to work. And wireless access points? Wireless access points can work with VLANs. You can do some pretty cool things, especially with enterprise wireless access points. But again, we're straying into Network Plus territory. Let's rather stop and focus on A+ questions and knowledge. And the reason why I say that is some of you might have decided to do things out of order. You might have done Network Plus or Security Plus or something before looking at doing A+. And if that's the way you're doing it, cool, you do you. But if you have learned, studied, and certified in the higher courses or the further courses in the journey, however you want to look at it, try not to use that more advanced knowledge to deal with A+ questions. So for this question, yeah, you would need a managed switch to implement VLANs initially. The other devices, yeah, they would be involved, but you got to start with creating the VLANs, setting them up, and getting them working. And to do that, you need managed switches. All right, so let's move on. Next question. Which of the following can provide expanded peripheral connectivity for any kind of laptop? Okay, this could be interesting. Let's see what the options are. A port replicator, a docking station, a USB hub, or an NFC adapter. So think about it for a bit if you want to. Pause the video if you need to. But let's work through it. We've got port replicators, docking station, USB hub, and NFC adapter. An NFC adapter is probably going to be a very poor candidate. Not because NFC is useless or unhelpful, it's just really slow. So that's not going to help most peripherals. Also, NFC is very, very short range. And I probably want to have my wireless mouse, for example, a bit further away from my laptop. Then NFC could work. So not a good option. A USB hub can be super useful because it would give me more USB ports, and that's always a problem I have with my laptops, is I never have enough USB ports on a laptop. But that's a personal thing. So although yes, it would help with peripheral connectivity, they didn't specify just USB devices. You might have things like, for example, second or third monitors you want to plug in. You might want an RJ45 connector for an Ethernet cable to go into your laptop, because a lot of laptops don't come with Ethernet adapters anymore, Wi-Fi only. So kind of a concern there, and USB won't always be the solution for that. Sort of keep it in the equation though. Docking stations and port replicators are going to be a better option for providing peripheral connectivity. But the question specified any kind of laptop. Now, when they say any kind of laptop, they're talking enterprise laptops and consumer laptops. Now, a docking station will work for the enterprise laptops, but not for the consumer laptops, because consumer laptops don't have that special connector on the underside of the laptop. Whereas a port replicator will work for enterprise and consumer. The problem that port replicator has is that it is unable to charge the laptop usually, and it connects via USB, but it would work with any kind of laptop. The docking station will only work with the enterprise laptop, and in some cases it has to match the manufacturer. So if company A produced the laptop, you probably have to get the docking station from company A for their enterprise laptops, limiting your flexibility and choice to handle any kind of laptop. Now, this is an interesting hallmark of something you need to watch for in a CompTIA exam. Sometimes there'll be certain keywords that don't stand out straight away. And it's one of the reasons why we often encourage people to read the question, read the options, and read the question again. At the very least, read the question again after you've chosen the answer you think is right, because you might have missed something the first time you read through it. Otherwise, though, let's move on to the next question. So, a technician is having challenges replacing a laptop's keyboard. Despite removing all the visible screws, the keyboard module seems to be stuck. What should the technician do? So let's see what the options are. Use a pry tool to force the keyboard out. Try moving the keyboard in all directions. Check the product manual for the removal procedure. Or remove all the keycaps. All four could be something that the technician should do next. So let's try and think what would be a good idea and the most straightforward to do. Using a pry tool to force the keyboard out, yeah, that could definitely work, but there's a very strong chance you might break something. A certain amount of force is necessary when working with computer hardware, especially on the internals, but too much force can be very, very dangerous because you're more likely to break something. And when you're dealing with laptop hardware, believe you me, there are some very, very fragile components inside. So the fact that they want to use a pry tool to magnify their force, I'm not thrilled about that option. Might be necessary, but I would leave that as my last resort. Moving the keyboard in all directions, maybe seeing if there's a bit of a wiggle or a particular angle the thing needs to be removed at, could work. But if that is the case, like you have to angle the keyboard a little bit for it to slide out, well, that would be in the product manual or the support manual, if there's a hardware support manual available for this laptop. Read the effing manual is very good advice working in IT, believe you me. In fact, a lot of people will say that working in IT, we're just the people that accept that reading the instructions is often the quickest and easiest way to do something. Removing the keycaps, in other words, pulling the keycaps or lids off of the keyboard, that might be necessary, might reveal a screw that was hidden. I don't know. But again, if you check the support manual or the documentation or anything like that, that tells you how to work with this laptop, especially to support it, would be the simpler option. You might have to remove the keycaps, you might have to jiggle the keyboard, you might even have to use a little bit of force, but check the manual, check the documentation. You don't have to rediscover something, you don't have to figure it out for yourself. There's no prizes for that. Rather check if there is a set of instructions that tells you do step A, do step B, do step C, do step D, etc. and follow that. You are more likely to be rewarded and recognized at the workplace for getting your job done effectively and efficiently, rather than just showing how much you can persevere and overcome unknown things. It's easier just to read the manual. So check the manual, seems like a good option here. An organization's management has been informed that they need to improve administrative control over their workforce's phones and tablets. Which of the following would best address this? So I'll give you a chance to think about options that allow better control over smartphones and tablets. But our options are MFA, MDM, VPN, and TLS. So let's work through these options. MFA is short for multi-factor authentication. Now this is a topic that we discuss more in A+ Core 2, but be prepared to see this where you have some topics and technologies coming from A+ Core 2 and appearing in A+ Core 1, and vice versa. The same thing can happen when you do the Core 2 exam. But MFA is not going to be addressing this problem, that I can guarantee you. Multi-factor authentication is probably going to leverage the person having a smartphone or a tablet, but it's not going to do much to actually improve admin control over these devices. MDM, or mobile device management, would be a better option for this. The reason why is MDMs are like domain controllers for phones and tablets, allowing centralized server-side control of settings, configuration, security, etc., as well as resource access. So this is going to probably be the better answer, but let's check the rest. A VPN, or a virtual private network. Again, this gets covered a bit more in A+ Core 2 than it does in Core 1, but you'll probably see it popping up in both exams either way. A VPN is an encryption technology that allows for safe and secure remote access to a trusted LAN environment. It effectively establishes a tunnel between 2 points over the internet and applies encryption to keep the contents of the tunnel safe. A VPN is not specific to laptops, desktops, smartphones, or tablets. Any client device, even servers, can support this. Yes, it would improve mobile device security, but it's not going to improve administrative control over the device. The MDM does that better. So, not a great answer. Then TLS, or Transport Layer Security. This is an encryption service that is used by most protocols that have encryption nowadays. This is again not going to improve administrative control. Will improve security, but they are specifically asking for something that improves administrative control. And that, my dear viewer, is the MDM. Next, we have a technician that receives a laptop that appears to have a bulge in the chassis. Not that kind of bulge. Behave yourselves. The laptop turns on when it's plugged in, but then turns off when the charger is disconnected. Which of the following is most likely the cause of the issue? Well, let's see what we have. We've got a malfunctioning charging cable, we've got a damaged charging port, we've got a swollen battery, and we've got a faulty screen. The swollen battery would definitely explain the bulge, and the fact it's also not holding charge, because when they disconnect the charger, the thing turns off. So that's a pretty strong candidate. But what's caused this battery to fail? Could be a number of things. There is the potential that the charging cable is malfunctioning, but not severely, because the laptop does run on the charging cable. So the person's obviously able to use it still. But the swollen battery is both a safety issue and obviously a functionality flaw, because obviously the laptop can't run without mains power now. So the cause of the symptom is that the battery has failed. Whether the charging cable is at fault, or maybe it was just a bad battery. Sometimes manufacturers get bad batches of components. It happens. But it's definitely not a damaged charging port, because in that case, then this laptop wouldn't be able to run at all, because it says here it's working fine when the charger's plugged in, but it's not working at all as soon as you unplug it. So the charging port must be fine. The screen being faulty, I don't think this has got anything to do with it. Apart from the screen turning off when the laptop turns off, I don't see any issue with the screen being brought up here. In fact, the screen's helping us diagnose the symptoms. I would go with the swollen battery first, and in the real world, where I might have to check more than one thing, I would maybe want to check out the charging cable afterwards just to figure out, has the charging cable possibly caused this battery to swell and fail? But for the exam purposes, this is one of those things where you pick one, and in this case, you're picking the answer that is explains the bulge, explains the not holding charge. So that's the best answer for that question. Moving along. So, after performing a clean installation of an operating system on a laptop, a technician notices that the web camera and the Bluetooth is unresponsive. Which of the following is most likely the cause of this issue? So I'll give you a chance to think about the options you'd like to see. But our options are: the OS and the device are incompatible, settings are disabled by default, corrupted installation files, or missing device drivers. So this is again another troubleshooting question. Please be prepared for A+ Core 1 to have a fair amount of them. Now you might be thinking, but we didn't cover operating systems in Core 1. True, we didn't. But it doesn't specify which operating system this is. This seems to be a hardware OS issue, so hardware does apply. So it's a reinstallation of an operating system. After a clean install of an operating system on a laptop, I'm going to assume it's the existing operating system that was already on the OS and they've just done a new one. Highly doubtful it's a compatibility issue. Settings being disabled by default? Possibly. There are a lot of operating systems that will have certain things turned off by default. But this says here that the webcam and Bluetooth is unresponsive, which means the person is trying to use an application and probably that application would have toggled the webcam and the Bluetooth on as it started up. So I'm not too sure about that being the right answer. Corrupted installation files could be a possibility. Sometimes things go wrong during operating system installation and could lead to maybe webcam and Bluetooth utilities within the operating system not working properly. But I'm more inclined to believe that we're missing device drivers. It could be a pretty unique webcam and or Bluetooth module that this machine has, and the operating system's generic drivers are just not working. So that would be my first point of call to figure out how to get this working. Check to see if the device drivers are installed, and check if it's the correct version of the drivers for any given operating system. That would be my first thing to check out. But eventually I would consider option C, but right now, that wouldn't be my first point of call. Maybe a corrupted installation of the operating system is the root cause of this issue and is what needs to be fixed, but that would probably be 5th or 6th on my list of possibilities. The device drivers would be the most likely thing that needs to be dealt with. And part of the problem that we're encountering nowadays is most operating systems, Windows, Linux, Unix, Mac OS, etc., do a really good job at supporting the hardware of the machines, especially Windows and Linux, to the point where a lot of people install an operating system and never ever need to install the device drivers for that hardware, as the operating system's generic drivers are really good. But having the device drivers for that specific hardware is actually better, and will resolve issues like that. Next up, a computer that was experiencing overheating issues had a newer, high-performance heatsink installed. However, it is not dissipating the heat as well as the heatsink manufacturer claims it will. What would be the cause of this? Let's see what the options are. New thermal paste was not applied. I'm feeling strong about that one already, but let's review. Ventilation holes are obstructed. The PSU is failing and overheating. Power supply unit if you forgot that acronym. Or RAM is overheating and affecting the CPU temperature. So firstly, let's eliminate a couple before we start trying to argue for which is the best option here. I doubt the ventilation holes on the computer case are obstructed. If they were, I want to smack the person who decided to buy something instead of clearing the blockages of the ventilation holes. So I highly doubt it's that. The power supply unit is failing and overheating. Power supply units sometimes do generate a little bit of extra heat during failure, but not enough that would offset an improved, better high-performance heatsink's ability to deal with heat. And also, depending on the computer case, the power supply might be in a completely separate physical chamber, dealing with a separate set of airflow. So I don't think it's that. So that leaves us with RAM overheating and affecting the CPU, or new thermal paste was not applied. RAM does generate heat, and the fresh, cool air that's meant to come in from the front of a computer case, pass over everything including the RAM, then encounters the CPU. So it is possible that the RAM's heat is affecting the CPU's cooler, but again, a better heatsink shouldn't have a problem with that. I'm more inclined to believe that when installing a new heatsink, forgetting to apply a fresh coat of thermal paste after removing the old thermal paste is the more likely mistake to make. People who are new to the industry and experienced professionals will often forget little things like this. And if you're thinking, wait, experienced professionals forget things like this? Yeah, you might be not giving the task 100% focus because you've done this how many times? And that's when you forget to do something because you thought you did it. So I'm likely to believe that the thermal paste wasn't applied. Then something like another hardware component is causing an issue. Now there are other things that could be going wrong as well. Maybe the person forgot to connect the cooling fan and stuff like that, but those are not options given to us in the exam. Even if you think there would be a more likely situation, or you encountered a scenario like this and it was a completely different thing that caused it, go with what's in the exam. Go with what options they present and pick that. Next, a department in an organization needs to use some legacy software that is incompatible with modern operating systems. This happens a lot more than you'd think. The legacy application does not need any local or internet services to work. I'm going to assume when they say local services, they probably mean local networking or LAN services. What would be the simplest way to run the legacy software and minimize risk? Well, let's see what options they have here. Option A virtual machine, decent option, in a public infrastructure as a service cloud. I'm not thrilled about a legacy application being ran in a VM in a cloud environment. It technically does work for the VM portion, but I'm not so mad about that part, especially because you have to pay for the resources to run a legacy application. Option B is the application is hosted in a public platform as a service cloud. I'm also not thrilled about that for the public cloud aspect, even though it's platform as a service. Plus, the problem with platform as a service is the cloud vendor could always update the OS in their part of the cloud responsibility matrix. They could decide to migrate the operating system, and then the application you're trying to run on this platform as a service offering no longer runs because it doesn't work with new operating systems. So, not really a good option here. An air-gapped workstation in the office, that could work. If you have an old computer separated from the rest of the network, running the appropriate operating system and supporting software environment for this application, you could run this legacy app. But is this an application that the person or the department within the organization might need immediate access to, and multiple people might need to share, in which case one workstation might not be enough. But this is a pretty good option in extreme situations. Or running a virtual machine on the department's client computers. That could also work pretty well, as you just have to teach the users how to run a VM. In fact, there are a couple cool ways you could actually have the VM running in the background only when the application launches. So, good options here. It runs locally, so this means you get full control. You are able to give the application the appropriate software environment, and because you've got full control over things, you've also got the ability to better secure it, which helps minimize risk. Running stuff in a public cloud, you do give up control. So of the two, the virtual machine would probably be the simplest way to get the old application running, because you can install whatever operating system you need to into that VM. And when you don't need it, the VM can shut down, be turned off, and that minimizes risk as well. So that's a decent option, but in a more extreme scenario, air gapping would be my second best choice. Now, if you're wondering why am I not obsessing about security like everybody else does, oh, don't worry, I do. But at the same time, you need to remember that security mustn't come at the cost of operations and capabilities. This organization, and specifically this department, need this legacy application. And depending on which type of department this is, users sometimes will work very strongly against any sort of security that they find to be too obstructive and too inconvenient. The virtual machine is more likely to be convenient enough that the users won't actively work against what we do. Because if users work against what we do and find ways to circumvent stuff, threat actors, hackers, and malware can piggyback off of the circumvention that the users discover. So I'm going to go with the virtual machine as the solution. Plus, it's also worth remembering that in A+ Core 1, we do cover things like cloud computing and virtualization, and this is a great use case for virtualization, running legacy software that you need to sometimes. Next, a group of users are having intermittent connectivity issues with a network printer. Which of the following could be reconfigured for the printer to resolve this issue? So we've got a default gateway, a DHCP server, static IP address, and a DNS server address. Now, I don't want us to worry too much about the fact that it is a printer. If we replace the term network printer with, let's say, file share server, the question wouldn't really change that much. This is more of a networking question than a printing question. So watch out for this in the exam, where they might use one type of device to make you think the question's dealing with something other than what it really is. This is a networking question. So let's have a look. We have a group of users, not the entire organization, having connectivity issues with a network entity. The most likely issue, I would say, is that they are trying to communicate with the incorrect IP address, because it's a group of users, not the whole organization. Now, could that group of users be in one LAN segment? Possibly. And have issues reaching the printer? Possibly. In which case you might say, well then, what if the default gateway is incorrect? Well, then that group of users would have no connectivity at all. They're having connectivity issues with one specific thing. So I don't think that's going to help out here. And other users must be having a perfectly fine experience accessing the printer, which means the default gateway of the printer is fine. So I don't think it's that. Changing the DHCP server, this is not a recommended thing. We usually don't recommend that you assign IP address information to any sort of network resource via DHCP. So I don't think we're using the incorrect DHCP server, because you shouldn't actually be using DHCP. You should be using a static IP address. That way you have consistency. Think about it this way. Your default gateway, the router that gets you in and out of the LAN that you're in, has a static IP address assigned to it. A web server, for example, that you might be running yourself, you'd probably want to favor a static IP address so that your DNS records can stay consistent. It's more than likely that this printer is receiving its IP address from a DHCP server, meaning that its address could potentially change and the group of users could be trying to communicate with the old address. So that is quite possibly the cause. Could also be DNS as well. There are particular printing services that you can set up in your network where your clients search out a specific DNS record that maps to the printer. So that is a possibility, but again, it's a group of people having an issue, and it would be their settings, not the printer's. In fact, printers very seldomly require DNS settings at all. So I'm going to go with the static IP addressing on the printer. If this is set correctly, and then all of the clients are told to go and search out that IP address when they need printing, that should solve issues for basic connectivity. And like I said at the beginning of this question, if you replace the word printer with file share server, for instance, the nature of the question wouldn't change that much. So I reckon the static IP address on the printer needs to be set correctly. Or if it hasn't got one, use it. Use a static IP address. Which of the following video connectors can carry video but not audio? So we have Thunderbolt, HDMI, DisplayPort, and VGA. So we got a pretty straightforward question here, checking to see, do you know about your connectivity and peripheral standards? Remember, your monitor is a peripheral as well as your audio output, whether it be a pair of headphones or a speaker. So a very simple way to look at it is this: video and audio. Now, if you're using Thunderbolt connectivity, it's that cool capability that nowadays runs through USB Type-C. It can do video, it can do audio, and it's got a whole bunch of other cool features that makes it very interesting. HDMI can do video, it can do audio. DisplayPort, it can do video, it can do audio. Now, some of you might be saying, but I don't get audio through my monitor. Well, does your monitor have speakers built in, or some sort of audio output to plug speakers into? But one thing I can guarantee you is VGA does do video. It does not do audio. So our answer here is VGA. Now, if you're thinking, but isn't VGA meant to be an older video standard? It is, but it's still clinging on to this day. There's a lot of offices and workplaces that still utilize this older outgoing video connection standard because it's perfectly fine for office work in many situations. Add to that, the monitors might have been bought back when VGA was still a pretty common and widely used standard. And those monitors are probably still working to this very day. Why throw them out? Believe you me, companies, businesses, organizations, governmental departments, etc., they don't throw away old technology, especially peripherals, if they're still working. So be prepared to work with some older standards in an enterprise environment or any kind of organization for that matter. Which of the following resolutions is commonly referred to as Full HD? We've got 1920 by 1080, 2560 by 1440, 3840 by 2160, and 7680 by 4320. This is relying on us knowing our screen resolutions, especially for monitors that usually use DisplayPort or HDMI and have that 16:9 style of aspect ratio. So straight out the bat, yes, it is option A. Option A is known as Full HD, as well as other things like 1080p or something like that. The reason why it's not B is known as 1440p. Sort of an in-between kid between Full HD and 4K. Some people also know 4K as Ultra HD or UHD. And then option D is also obviously not right because it's way too high resolution. That is known as 8K, which is a fairly recent standard at the time of this video being made. And probably something you're not going to encounter in many workplaces just yet, although some of you might be the exceptions, not the rule. Either way, the question asked us, what is Full HD's resolution? And the answer is A, 1920 by 1080. Next up, which type of network makes extensive use of switches and wireless access points? This should be interesting. Let's see what the options are. A PAN, a LAN, a WAN, and a MAN. So a PAN, or a personal area network, this is usually a Bluetooth technology. There are some wireless access points that can support Bluetooth, but I haven't seen many switches support Bluetooth. So I'm going to put a bit of a dotted cross through PAN for now. I can always change it. A LAN is a pretty good option. Most local area networks make a heavy, extensive use of switches for cabled connectivity, and then wireless access points plugged into those switches for phones, laptops, and other types of wireless clients. So I'm feeling very strong about the LAN. The WAN, or the wide area network, technically ISPs do have a type of switch, but they don't really use wireless access points. If they do use anything that's wireless, it's more than likely going to be radio area network equipment, or RAN equipment, which is designed for longer ranges. Wireless access points are meant for wireless client connectivity to a LAN. So you've got to stretch to justify that fitting, whereas LAN is a better fit. Metropolitan area networks is that awkward in-between kind of network where an organization might want to provide connectivity between buildings and premises in a small metropolitan area, either by relying on an ISP who specializes in metropolitan area networking, or that organization doing their own private metropolitan area network. But you might not make that much extensive use of wireless access points, and if you do, they'll be highly specialized. And again, we're stretching. We've got a good fit answer already, so let's go with LAN. Next up, which of the following is not a valid IP version 6 address? Now, before we look at the options, I just want to point out that the word not here is emphasized. Sometimes CompTIA will be nice and they'll emphasize certain words, like for example, when they ask you to tell them what is not something correct or whatever, they'll often type it in all caps. But sometimes they don't always do that, so you might have to spot the emphasis yourself. So let's have a look at our options here. We've got option A, FE80:00:B4BB:8399:B4BB:5507:D623:0777:FFFF. We've got option B, which is just ::1. Then we've got option C, FF02:00:00:00:00:00:00:00:00:00:00:00:00:00:00:00:000:00:000:00:000:00:000:00 :0000:000:000:000:000:000:000:000:000:000:000:000:000:000:000:000:000:000:000:000:000:000:000:000:000:000:000:000:000:000:000 If I stuffed up any of the zeros there, I do apologize. And then we got option D, which is FEBG::A100:321. Alright, so let's first have a look at option A. Option A seems fine at first. Option B seems a bit wrong, but this is actually correct. They've used something called address shortening or condensing. What happens with IPv6 is you can drop leading zeros in a field of values. So if you've got some zeros at the beginning, you can drop them. And if you've got multiple fields of zeros, you can also condense them into a double colon. So if that was written out fully, it would be 7 fields of all 0, and the last field, the 8th one, would be 0001. So that's a correct IP version 6 address. It's just very, very shortened. In fact, that's actually specifically the IP version 6 loopback address. V6 is equivalent to 127.something.something.something. Now, for those of you who have looked at a few IPv6 addresses and you're seeing option C and you said, I've never seen FF02 before, well, that is actually a correct address. Specifically, FF something something is IP version 6's multicast range. FF02 is specifically local LAN segment multicasting. So that is a perfectly correct and viable IP version 6 address. So that leaves us with options A and D. Well, if we have a look at option A, we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 fields, all 4 hexadecimal characters long, They all seem fine. The values seem correct. I don't see anything wrong with option A. Option D, they've used some shortening. Nothing wrong with that. They've used some shortening there as well. They dropped a leading 0. Nothing wrong with that. Both are perfectly fine. Here's the issue though. G is not hexadecimal. Hexadecimal counts 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 as you and I recognize them as normal numbers. And then A, B, C, D, E, F appear as additional values in the hexadecimal numbering system. G is not one of them. So the answer that we're looking for here is D. D is not a valid IP version 6 address. Options A, B, and C, if you were to type those into a computer, they'd be fine with that. Whether you are telling the computer that's its address or to communicate with that address. But if you try to use D, either as the address for that computer or telling the computer to communicate with that address, I can guarantee you'll get an error. So D is the correct answer here. D is not a valid IP version 6 address. Now, IPv6 can be quite intimidating, especially when you're new to networking. IPv4 is already difficult enough, but there's 2 facts you need to accept. Number 1, IP version 6 will eventually take over from IP version 4. And despite the numbering system making it look harder, it actually is a simpler addressing scheme, I promise. It's just familiarity with version 4 that keeps people comfortable, and also that the fact that IP version 4 addresses use numbers that we're pretty comfortable with. But the good news is, with A+, they don't go too hard on IP version 6. Next question. Which of the following does a network switch use to make forwarding decisions about traffic? So let's see what the options are, but hopefully you've already thought of an answer you'd like to see. You've got an IP address, a MAC address, a host name, and a port number. Now, for those of you who remember how switches work, you'd straight away recognize a MAC address is the correct answer. Switches make their forwarding decisions by looking at the source and destination MAC address. Specifically, they look at the source MAC address of traffic to learn, okay, this MAC address I've seen on this interface. And then they look at the destination MAC address and check in their MAC address table, have they seen that one before? And which interface is it on? An IP address is primarily used by routers. Now, at the risk of confusing you, you do get something called a layer 3 switch or a multi-layer switch. It's something you'll encounter more in Network Plus, but CompTIA might decide to use it to try and throw you a curveball in A+. Don't stress about it, a switch is still a switch. It primarily makes decisions based on MAC addresses. If you want to learn more about the multi-layer switches, feel free to go check out my Network Plus series. Now, a host name. This is something that a switch does not use to resolve addresses and decide where to go. Usually what happens is clients and servers rely more on host names and then query a DNS server to get that host name resolved to an IP address for communications. And a port number, not used by a switch. Port numbers, specifically we're talking the TCP/IP port numbers like those ones where we say 80 is for HTTP, 25 is for SMTP, end of thinking capacity. Those are not used by switches. At most they're used by routers and firewalls and other higher layer appliances according to the networking models. So that's the answer to that question. An organization wants a file server to have redundant local storage, but would like to minimize the amount of disk space used for redundancy. Which of the following RAID implementations would meet their needs? Now, with questions like this, you might have a situation where there's a RAID level that you know would be perfect for this, or even if it's not RAID, a configuration, a setup, or an option that would be better than what's presented to you in the exam. But what I want you to do in that case is to forget about what's the best of the best options and choose the best of the presented options for your question. As much as it might irritate you that you know there's a better way to do it than what has been put forward in the exam, that's not what they're testing. They're testing, can you choose the best option presented? I myself run into that challenge very often with the CompTIA exam where I know there's a better option than what's listed in the question, but that's not how you pass these exams. You pass these exams by choosing what the examiner believes the correct answer is. So our options are RAID 0, RAID 1, RAID 5, and RAID 10. which I'm hoping you remember from my RAID video. My storage video is a combination level of RAID, whereas RAID 1 plus 0 is 2 levels of RAID working together. Now, some of you might be pulling to RAID 0 straight away because that would definitely minimize the amount of disk space being used for redundancy, because RAID 0 doesn't do redundancy. But there's a problem with that. They want redundant storage. They just want to minimize the amount of space dedicated to redundancy. So RAID 0, not a good option. RAID 1. RAID 1 does provide us with redundancy. So that's a tick on the redundancy. But it uses half your storage to achieve that. So it's a very, very costly form of redundancy. RAID 5, also a tick on the redundancy, and it uses parity to actually make the redundancy somewhat compact. It does rely on a hot spare or a new drive to be inserted into the array when one fails. But RAID 5 does provide pretty compact redundancy. So that's looking like a pretty good option, especially compared to RAID 1. Now RAID 10, or 1 plus 0 if you like it like that, what happens is that's taking multiple RAID 1 arrays and then making them work together in RAID 0. The thing is, you don't get any redundancy from the RAID 0, but you do get massive performance bonuses. But over here, they're not asking you to set up a RAID array that gives good performance. And the fact that it uses RAID 1 means half of your disks are still going to redundancy, which means not what they're asking for. Although RAID 5 might seem like the poorer choice in terms of performance, it meets the requirements of what they're asking for. They want redundant storage, but they want to minimize the amount of disk space required for redundancy. They don't tell us how many disks they're going to have or exactly how they're going to configure the RAID array, so I can't give you a perfect number and a definitive answer of, oh yes, this will be better for exactly this numerical reason. But given the parameters of the question, RAID 5 would be the best option to provide redundancy while minimizing the amount of disk space needed for the redundancy. Moving along though. A network administrator has been asked to update a host computer's DNS record after a new IP address has been allocated to it. Which of the following record types needs to be updated? So the first option is a quadruple A record, the second option is an MX record, the third option is an A record, and the fourth option is a TXT record. So let's run through these four. We have quadruple A, which is the IPv6 host record. MX is a mail exchange record. The A record is an IPv4 host, and TXT is a text record. As mentioned in a previous question, TXT records were originally a note-taking method for DNS administrators and is now used by things like SPF, DKIM, and DMARC. Now, in terms of going back to the question, they're asking for us to work on a host record. It says there a host computer. Now, usually when we say host computer, it could be a server, it could be a client, it doesn't matter. But we've got two that deal specifically with hosts. If they said an email server, yeah, I'd be updating the MX record. If they said anything about email security, I might be messing around with the TXT records. But they asked for host records. Now, here's the trick though. Are they talking about IPv6 or IPv4? Because they don't specify it in the question. So that means that both A and C as an answer are equally viable. But here's the trick. We usually assume IPv4 if they don't specify the version of IP. At least at the moment. At some point in the future, that might flip. So that means the option is the A record, or answer C, not the quadruple A answer. As I said, we're doing that based on the assumption that when we're talking about IP, unless we specifically say IP version 6, we usually are talking about IP version 4 when we just say IP address. Next, which of the following is a valid public IP address? Let's see what we have here. So we've got 10.254.255.18. We've got 17.2.16.11. We've got 172.16.88.107. And we've got 192.168.223.40. Okay, so this relies on you remembering what are valid public IPv4 addresses and which addresses are private, reserved, or special. Go back and check out my video on IP version 4 addressing for A+, if you're a bit rusty on this. But we can straight away knock out answer A and D, because the entire 10 network is private. All of the 192.168 networks are also private. They're asking for public address. Now, this is where you need to really read carefully. This is a trick that's often used in a lot of exams, where they'll use something that looks very similar in terms of numbers, but the position of the separator, in this case with IP version 4, the dots in dotted decimal notation, is going to make the difference. You got 172.16. Then you got 17.2.16. That's a public address. This is private. Everything from 172.16 through to 172.31 is part of Class B's private address space. But a little trick with where the dot is positioned can make or break your exam experience. So read carefully when you see loads of addresses here. I've seen CompTIA and other vendors do this type of trick to see who is paying attention, who is reading carefully, and who is not. Now, we have a technician who's been asked to allocate a laptop to a new user. The user will be working in the financial department. Below are the 4 CPU models that are in the available laptops. The technician needs to choose a laptop that has an appropriate CPU for the user. Which of the following would be the most suitable? So we have an Intel Core 9, we have an Intel Xeon, we have an Intel Core 7, and an Intel Core 5. So this is obviously the newer naming convention that Intel is using. Cool. So what we're trying to do here is figure out what would be the most appropriate CPU, or at least hardware spec, to allocate to a user. They're not asking us what's the right amount of RAM, storage, or stuff like that. We're focusing on one thing and one thing only. What would be the right type of CPU for a relatively ordinary, run-of-the-mill office job? Well, we can straight away eliminate the Intel Xeon. This is a high-performance workstation / server class CPU, so not an option we want to go for. The Intel Core series, the older Core i3, i5, i7, etc., and the newer Core series are more geared towards end-user consumer type of computing. So that's definitely going to be a lot more applicable. Now, the Core 9 and the Core 7, these are considered high-performance CPUs, able to handle a lot of heavy multi-threaded workloads. So developers, computer-aided design, graphic design, etc., they all benefit from those higher performance cores. The Core 5 is more suitable to this use case scenario. In fact, the Core 3 is also perfectly suitable and fine for office work as well, but there isn't a Core 3 in the options here. So the Core 5 would definitely be more than adequate for a financial user, whether they be somebody just forecasting expenditure or they're an accountant. I don't know, I'm not a financial person. But I can tell you now, the Core 5 would be the more suitable CPU to allocate to them. If they're a developer, definitely a Core 7, maybe a Core 9, depends on what they're working on. But the Intel Xeon definitely not appropriate. So I'd say we go with Intel Core 5, not the 7, not the 9, and that should be ideal. I'm pretty sure there's going to be somebody out there that's going to say, oh, our financial people need an Intel Core 7 or i7 because of how hard their financial applications push the computer. But usually when it comes to allocating resources to a user, it's a lot easier to give them what you think is appropriate, and if it turns out it can't keep up with the workload, well, we can always upgrade them. But users never complain when their computers are doing too well. And believe you me, you're going to run out of money very quickly if you keep giving your users the best hardware possible. The job is to give them the best hardware for their job role. After installing and connecting a new switch to the network, the upstream connection to the next switch lights up for a moment before turning off. This repeats continually, and all clients connected to the switch, I'm going to assume they're talking about the new switch, experience connectivity issues. Which of the following is most likely the cause? So with questions like this, you might want to do a little bit of a sketch. So we'll have our original switch, and we'll have our new switch, and some rather ugly clients connected to it. Not an overly complicated visual, but it does sometimes help to try and sketch out what they're describing to you in words. And yes, this does happen in the exam, where they might describe something to you instead of giving you a picture, but a picture would have made this maybe a bit easier to deal with. So our options are port flapping, external interference, high latency, or a broadcast storm. So in terms of the symptoms, let's focus on that. Interface lights up before turning off. And the users are experiencing connectivity issues, so they're seeing no network. This could potentially be port flapping, where an interface works, stops working, works, stops working, works, stops working, up and down continually. External interference, the lights would stay on. They wouldn't turn off for interference. You definitely would get connectivity issues if the interference was bad enough. But usually the symptoms of interference is relatively slow communications, a high volume of malformed or corrupted packets, a significant amount of retransmissions of packets if they're TCP based, and in extreme circumstances, yes, all connectivity would fail. But by that point, you would have had plenty of symptoms and heads up. This is like immediate by the sounds of things. High latency. Latency is a measure of time, how long it takes to get something somewhere. I doubt latency would cause an interface indicator light to turn on and off, on and off, on and off. So I don't think it's that. It could potentially be a broadcast storm occurring. But there's a few points to keep in mind. There's a protocol that switches run called span-and-tree protocol that is used to detect loops and prevent broadcast storms by logically blocking off that loop. And also, they never specified if a loop was created here. This is a new switch with an upstream connection. I'm going to assume the simplest, most straightforward setup where the new switch connects directly to the original switch. So I don't think it's a broadcast storm. Port flapping would make more sense. The light turns on, the light turns off as the interface starts and stops working. Now the cause of port flapping could be a bad cable, bad termination on either end of the cable or both ends. It could be a faulty interface. I mean, the original switch might have never had anything plugged into that interface before, so we'd be none the wiser until we did plug something in. It could be maybe a bit of dust or debris messing with some of the connections, causing the port to flap up and down because unused interfaces on a switch don't have dust covers or stuff like that. So there could be a number of things that could be causing an interface to flap up and down. But a physical visible inspection would definitely go quite a long way to working out if that is the cause or not. You could check the termination looks good, you could make sure there's nothing obstructing or blocking the ports. Stuff like that will work pretty well. Next up, which of the following connector types is commonly used for fiber-based internet deployments? This could be interesting. I'll give you a chance to try and remember which type of connectors are being used by fiber optic. And then let's have a look at the options given. So you got DB9, SC, F-type, RJ45. So RJ45 I'm going to kill straight away because this is used by Twisted Pair Ethernet. And we're talking about a fiber-based internet deployment, which means something that a fiber optic service provider would probably be using. DB9? No. That's the type of interface used by things like serial connectors, VGA, the old printer parallel port, stuff like that. That's the name of that form factor, so no, it's not DB9. With F-type, that's the coaxial interface. Not really. Some fiber optic service providers might use copper as the last mile to the customer/premises, but when we say a fiber-based internet deployment, we usually do indicate or hint at the fact that it's probably fiber all the way up to the premises, the customer, the home, whatever. And in that case, usually they're using an SC or the subscriber connector. That is a fiber connector. If you were thinking about the straight tip or the ST connector or the LC lucent connector, those are fiber optic connectors, you're correct. But usually a lot of fiber optic service providers do favor the subscriber connector, that little square shaped one. So in that case, it's the SC connector. In an industrial setting, where there may be a lot of large machines, which of the following network cables is not suitable for such an environment? Now, before we look at the options, industrial environment, large machinery. They're hinting at strong electrical interference. So, what options do they give us? STP, or shielded twisted pair, UTP or unshielded twisted pair, MMF, multi-mode fiber, or coaxial, which is coaxial. And they're looking for which type of cable is not ideal here. Now, a lot of you are probably thinking, okay, STP, shielded twisted pair, the metal shielding would probably make it perfectly fine and able to handle electrical interference, and you're right, especially if you use the shielded RJ45 connector. So that cable would work fine in an industrial environment. But we're looking for the cable that doesn't work well. So that's going to work fine, so it's not the option we're looking for. Unshielded twisted pair. The lack of shielding should probably be making you think, this could be dangerous, this could be problematic. So it's a contender for who should not be used in this situation. Fiber optic cables, they work fine in most factories. As long as nothing damages them, bends them, breaks them, or cuts them, they're going to be perfectly A-OK and not experience any sort of electromagnetic interference. So they would be fine in a factory, therefore it's not the one we're looking for. Coaxial. A lot of you might be looking at going, that's slow, that's old, it's copper-based, but here's the thing. All coaxial cables actually have shielding in them. That metal layer just below the outer jacket is both grounding and also shielding, so it would work fine in an interference environment, albeit very slowly. Unshielded twisted pair is the problem in an industrial setting. Unshielded twisted pair is usually A-OK in a home environment or an office environment, but when it comes to any sort of industrial environment, you probably want something that's able to handle electromagnetic interference. And shielded twisted pair is fine for that, fiber is fine for that, coax is fine for that. Good luck finding coax interfaces nowadays, with the exception of cable internet service providers. But for this situation, we're looking for the cable that would work worst, and that will be the UTP cable. It's a weird approach to questions. What's the wrong answer? But be prepared for questions in the exam that ask you, what's the worst answer? What's the wrong thing to do? What's the bad choice as the right answer? It's a weird questioning technique, but it forces you to do a double think in the exam. And the problem is, in the exam, there's going to be pressure and stress that's going to make it a little bit harder for you to double think. Because a lot of you are probably thinking, yes, shielded twisted pair, perfect to use in an industrial environment. Fiber, perfect for an industrial environment. And that's right. They're perfect. But they're asking us which one's not the right tool for the job here. And that's UTP. Which video connector type, now considered legacy, can still be found in many office environments? We've got HDMI, DisplayPort, VGA, and S-Video. DisplayPort or DP and HDMI, these are considered modern and current, so based on the fact that we're looking for legacy, we can eliminate those. But can still be found in many office environments. VGA and S-Video do tick the box of being legacy. And chances are some of you have gone, yeah, I remember seeing and hearing people talking about VGA. Who knows, you might even be using VGA or have encountered VGA yourself. In which case, great. It is considered legacy and it's still being used. But if you're going, what on earth is S-Video? It's legacy, but not still found in the workplace or the personal place that much anymore. So we're going to go with VGA as the best answer for this question. A video editing workstation has intermittent display issues. The image on the screen keeps flickering and sometimes the picture goes completely. What should be checked first? Now, normally whenever I see a question like this in a CompTIA A+ exam, I know that at least two, if not all, of the options they present are going to be viable. So we need to always keep in mind they're asking, what do we check first? So let's see. Option A, inspect the motherboard for swollen and failing capacitors. That could cause an issue with display output depending on which capacitors are failing. Option B, check that conflicting graphics card drivers are not installed. That can be a big issue if this workstation has had a graphics card update, because maybe they went from, let's say, an NVIDIA graphics card to an AMD ATI graphics card, or vice versa, or sometimes even going from one video card to the next from the same manufacturer. The old drivers can conflict. So that could be an option. Check that the graphics card drivers are up to date. you'd be surprised how often just doing an update on something like your video card drivers, or actually any piece of software for that matter, can actually resolve a lot of issues. Especially when some software applications have been kept up to date but others haven't, yet in the background those applications interact in some way or form. And I could easily see that happening on a video editing workstation. And then option D, ensure the power and video cables are properly connected. Again, also a good option. So here we've got 4 viable, perfectly good options for troubleshooting, and each of them would be something I would look at checking. But our golden rule for troubleshooting is always check simple things first. And the simplest thing to check is make sure that the video cables are plugged in. Then move to other things. Now, one of the reasons why I would make sure that the power and the video cables are properly connected is I don't have to mess around with any settings. I don't have to open up the computer to check for swollen capacitors as option A is offering. I don't have to mess around that much. And it won't take more than a second or two. Okay, maybe I'm exaggerating, but it definitely won't take more than 10 to 30 seconds just to verify. And you know what? I would rather just take that extra few seconds just to be sure it's not a physical connectivity thing than to go and start messing around with settings and software unnecessarily. Although I don't think you or I would cause any problems by messing around with software settings, updates, and drivers, the less we meddle with that's uninvolved with the problem, the better, because we're less likely to cause a new issue. So, although this question seemed very involved, it's basically just checking, do you remember to check simple things first, and then move on to more complicated and involved theories of probable cause. So option D is the better option here. Not to say we wouldn't check the other things if it turns out that the cables are properly connected, be they power or video. Which of the following Wi-Fi standards does not support 5 GHz? So let's see what standards they have for us. We have 802.11g, N, AC, and BE. So the good thing is, at least they are all the Wi-Fi standards, or WLAN if you want to be truly correct with the title of the IEEE documentation. So it's a case of, is it G, is it N, is it AC, is it BE? Well, for those of you that remember your frequencies pretty well, you'll remember that 802.11g is 2,4 GHz only. N is 5 and 2,4 GHz. AC is 5 GHz officially, but also 2,4 GHz in reality. Go watch my Wi-Fi video if you want to understand that statement more. And 802.11be is 2,4, 5, and 6 GHz, as that's the newer Wi-Fi 7 standard. So our answer is G. The nice thing about A+ Core 1 is you actually are going to get a fair amount of questions that if you just memorize these little details, you'll have an easy time answering these questions. I'm not going to guarantee you'd pass, but it's definitely going to make up a decent majority of your questions, enough that you'll be able to answer them quickly if you studied well, and that can buy you more time to answer the more involved questions where you've got to think a bit about what the right answer would be. Next, which of the following wireless communications will not be possible to turn on while a smartphone is in flight mode? Okay, this should be interesting. If you want to think about the options, pause. Otherwise though, let's check them out. Wi-Fi, Bluetooth, cellular, and NFC. So this question is looking at, okay, the person puts flight mode or airplane mode on their phone. That usually turns off all wireless communications, but you can turn some back on. Now usually Wi-Fi you can turn back on, Bluetooth as well, and NFC, because there's a variety of reasons why you might want those to work on a flight. It's probably cellular that they're looking for. That's the one that will be kept off, as cellular has frequencies that can interfere with older airplane communications. But the main reason why it would be kept off, and the main reason why they want your phone off, especially during takeoff and landing, is those are dangerous times in the flight and they don't want passengers distracted. Swiping TikTok or whatever is going to not be helpful when you need to evacuate that plane in 90 seconds or less. So yeah, on most phones, turning flight mode on quickly kills all wireless communications, but you can toggle your Wi-Fi, your Bluetooth, and your NFC back on. Cellular, however, you can't turn back on until you turn the flight mode or airplane mode off again. And that's true for all smartphone operating systems. Next up, which of the following is an advantage of private cloud? This could be good. Now, you can sit and think about, well, why would I want a private cloud over a public cloud or anything else? But in this case, we're going to need to see the options and figure it out. So, we have got A, the ability to reduce cost. B, increased control over security and data. That's already a strong contender. C, lower upfront costs compared to public cloud. That seems like a backward statement, but anyway. And then resources are shared with multiple external organizations. Okay, I'm going to eliminate D straight away because this sounds like public cloud, not private cloud. So that's straight away out of the equation. Now, in terms of C, I said that sounds a bit backwards. Lower upfront costs compared to public cloud. There is an argument to be made for that. If you've already got an extensive data center, converting that into a private cloud can actually be quite cheap. But at the same time, public cloud isn't expensive to start with. Most public cloud service providers operate on a pay-as-you-use or a utility model, where whatever you're running in the cloud is what you're paying for, computationally speaking. Same for storage. The more you store, the more you pay. So that seems like a bit of a weird statement that's both correct and incorrect at the same time. It would depend too much on specific circumstances, and obviously this question doesn't give us any context or circumstances to work with. So I'm a bit cautious about choosing that one. Increase control over security and your data. That is a very strong benefit and a very good reason to stick for private cloud, because you retain control of everything. The ability to reduce cost, again, debatable. You can run a private cloud very cost efficiently, but I can guarantee you a public cloud service provider can do what you're doing at the same price point, because there are certain expenses that you bear the full cost of that the customer of a public cloud service provider wouldn't. So, for example, what happens when it comes time to upgrading to better performing hardware or replacing hard drives as they start to age out? You have to pay that entire price, whereas the public cloud, all the customers share the cost and it's baked into the price they're paying. So that leaves us basically with B and C, and I already said C I'm not very happy with because it's too circumstantial and they haven't given us any details to work out which would be the correct circumstance. So I'm going to go with B, that you've got full control of everything. A user reports that their laptop frequently disconnects from the Wi-Fi when moving between offices in a building. The other users do not experience this issue. Which of the following is most likely the cause? This could be interesting. So we're going to have to get the options before we can even think about what we would like as an answer. So option A, the laptop's wireless adapter is configured for the incorrect security protocol. Option B, the laptop has outdated wireless drivers. Option C, the access points are operating on overlapping channels. The DHCP lease time is too short for option D. A few things to keep in mind. One user is having this issue, and other users are not experiencing the same issue. So in this case, it's the individual and their connection to the network. If other users were experiencing the same issue, then I'm more inclined to believe it's more to do with the network and how the network has been set up. So that in mind, that means I'm doubting it's DHCP. The reason why I don't think it's the DHCP lease time is if the lease time was too short and the IP address was being revoked at critical communication times, this would be affecting more users, because every user who gets an IP address from the same DHCP server has the same lease time. Alright, jumping around now, let's have a look at option C. The access points are operating on overlapping channels. Again, if this was the case where you've got two neighboring access points both operating at the same channel, exactly the same frequency, that would affect all the users connected to and associated with that pair of access points. And the question states it's just one person, so not that one. So that leaves us with A and B. In both cases with A and B, it's the individual laptop. The laptop's wireless adapter is configured for the incorrect security protocol, and then the laptop has outdated wireless drivers. And I can eliminate A straight away. And the reason why I can do that is if it was the incorrect security protocol, like let's say the laptop set to use WPA2 and the access point uses WPA3, the user would not connect at all. The question says the user frequently disconnects from the wireless network, which means they are able to connect. If the security settings were incorrect, the access point would reject them outright. They would never get that connection to lose. So this person's having an issue with losing the connection. So that leaves us with the laptop has outdated wireless drivers, and that is a possibility. Now, although all options did seem pretty decent and can all affect Wi-Fi connectivity, there is the possibility that an incorrect security protocol set up on the client is causing an issue, but then the person wouldn't connect at all. For the access points being in overlapping channels, yes, that can cause connectivity issues for the users that are trying to use those access points. But then it would be affecting multiple users, not just one. And then same for the DHCP server. If the least duration is too short, it would screw over all the users, not just one. So the option that best matches the conditions and the symptoms is option B. Although it could be something else, I would be more inclined to go with, yeah, maybe it needs some updates before I start messing around with entire network configurations. Ooh, we get to label a diagram. This is something you can expect to have in CompTIA A+, where you're going to be given a picture and asked to label the components, just to prove that you recognize and know how to work with computers' internal hardware. So we've got a picture of a motherboard, and we're told to label the components as shown. So we got a bunch of label blocks, number 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, and we've got option A is a CPU, B is a front panel header, C is a SATA drive connector, D is a PCIe slot, and E is the CPU power. So the first thing you want to do is find the CPU. That's a fantastic point for orientation, and here it is. So 3 is A, which is the CPU. Now, to the side of the CPU, the long rectangular slots are RAM. That's great, but they're not asking us to label RAM. Okay, let's move along. Oh yes, down in this area of the motherboard is usually where you'll find your drive connectors, and they are asking us number 5, and we have got a SATA drive connector. So that is C. Then, moving around, we've got these little pins over here, bottom right corner. You do have to turn your head 90 degrees to the right. That's normally how I like to look at a motherboard. And option 4 is labeling those pins. Those pins would be our front panel header pins. So 4 is B. Moving around a bit, we come across this slot over here. These are part of our expansion slots. Now this motherboard has a mixture of PCI slots. So these ones over here. This one's a PCIe slot. Probably an X16, judging by the appearance of it. And the one just above it is probably the PCIe X1. The slot and notch towards the side of the motherboard over here gives it away, and the fact it's got this retaining clip over there is what tells me it's a PCIe slot. So that was which one? Number 1, and PCIe is letter D, so 1D. And then number 2 is over here. And that is the CPU power connector. If you're thinking, hang on, but what about this one over here? That's the motherboard power connector. The CPU's power connector is always near the CPU socket itself. It might be a 4 or an 8-pin connector, but it normally is always near the CPU. So do be prepared to get various internal hardware components and expected to label them in the exam. Whether it be a motherboard or something else, I cannot make a guarantee about that, but as long as you've been sort of looking a little bit at computer hardware, learning as best you can, you should be okay with most of it. Which of the following technologies allows for the automated allocation of IP address information to a client? So I'll give you a chance to think about the options you want to see. Pause if you need to. But the options are a VPN, DHCP, DNS, and VLANs. Now, this is going to be quite common in the A+ Core 1 exam, where you're going to get pretty straightforward questions where you just need to know the answer. It's a simple fact-answer style of questioning. And some of you might be going straight away for DHCP. For those of you that know straight away, that's the answer. But for those of you that need to work it out, well, process of elimination. VPNs provide a secure tunnel, so not allocating IP addresses. DNS resolves names, so not DNS. And VLANs are about segmentation that is done logically across the network. So that is the first answer, DHCP. It allocates your IP address, your subnet mask, your default gateway, and any optional information, including the address of a DNS server. Moving along now. Next up, which of these RAM characteristics is not commonly found on PCs? I'll give you a chance to think about it. Pause if you want to. But our options are dual channel, DDR4, triple channel, and ECC. Now, all of these are RAM features, so it's going to be kind of difficult to eliminate them. But they said PCs, so this would mean desktops and laptops. A server class feature. Now, dual channel is a common feature across all modern computers, whether it be a laptop, a desktop, or a server. In fact, more than likely you're going to see triple channel and quad channel nowadays. So we can eliminate A and C straight away there. Then DDR4 is a data rate multiplier. So that's something you probably would see again on all RAM form factors, leaving us with ECC. Now, some of you might have jumped straight to ECC as it came up, and if you did, fantastic. If you didn't, don't feel bad. Process of elimination works wonders. But what is ECC? ECC, or error correction code, is a feature in RAM that allows the RAM modules to correct when a binary bit flips. Now, this is obviously very useful for data stability and overall system stability, and that would be massively beneficial on a server. You don't want to waste processing cycles fixing issues, as those wasted processing cycles affect overall performance and everybody who relies on that server. But having that on an end-user computer, like a laptop or a desktop, not really worth it. That's that answer, so let's move on. Which of the following protocols is used for email communications? So think about the email protocols you know about. There's 3 main ones. And our options are DNS, SNMP, IMAP, and DHCP. I'm hoping you gravitated straight towards IMAP because that is one of the 3 email protocols. You're looking at SMTP, Simple Mail Transfer Protocol, Post Office Protocol, usually version 3, so POP3 is a common listing, and Internet Messaging Access Protocol, sometimes listed as IMAP 4 because the latest version is version 4. I'm hoping that's what you thought about straight away. But if you needed to do process of elimination, let's do it. DNS is name resolution, not emails. SNMP, that was sort of a booby trap there because it's a very similar acronym to SMTP. But SNMP is the Simple Network Management Protocol, which is there for monitoring and possibly managing configuration of your network appliances. You'll learn more about that in Network Plus. And DHCP allocates IP addresses, subnet masks, and gateways, but it doesn't handle emails. So that's how we would tackle that. Moving along. Next, a user reports when they print a document. The document looks washed out and unclear. They have tried different documents and multiple printers on their floor of the office. The printers are all laser printers. What is most likely the cause of this issue? Okay, again, another scenario question is probably going to be better if we see the options before we think about them. So here are the options. Read through, pause if you want to, but let's look at them. The user has economic print settings enabled on their computer. Surprising, but that could definitely be it. Let's move along and look at the rest. The printers in the floor of the office are due for scheduled maintenance. That could be. The printer driver needs to be reinstalled for the user. Or the toner is substandard and is not transferring and fusing properly during the printing process. And again, all of these are quite possible. So let's start eliminating what we know it can't be. Now, it is possible that all the printers in the floor are due for maintenance, leading to this issue, but I highly doubt they'd all be giving the same print quality from the same user. Some printers might be in more need of a service than others. So I don't see that being the issue. The printer driver needs to be reinstalled for the user. I don't think so, as that would have more impact on their ability to print at all, never mind with the quality issue they're having. So they're having no issue getting the print job done. It's the quality of the output that's the issue. So I don't think it's the driver. The toner that they're using might be substandard, and considering that they mentioned this is an office place, it is quite possible that an organization is using substandard cheap toner to save some money. But they did say it's one user having an issue, not many people. So if it was substandard toner, then everybody would be complaining. Here, they just said a user, not a bunch of users. So that leaves us with option A. The user has economic print settings enabled on their computer. And that option seems pretty good, because if the user is able to try a print job with different printers and all of them are giving a washed out image, it could be eco printing. Economic print settings usually try to use less ink or toner on a print job, and it's normally done just for cost saving in a home environment, and that setting doesn't magically disappear just because you're in an enterprise environment. Besides which, eco-conscious and cost-conscious users would go for the eco setting if it's just a quick print that they need to refer to, but not something they're going to be sharing with others. In which case the quality doesn't really matter too much then. So I'm happiest with that option. Moving along. So, which of the following is used to support tap and pay solutions for smartphones, smartwatches, and bank cards? We've got NFC, Bluetooth, RFID, and Z-Wave. I'll give you a chance to think about which option you like. Pause if you wanna. But we can straight away eliminate Bluetooth, as generally we don't pay through Bluetooth. We normally do peripheral pairing. So, phone to watch, phone to car kit, phone to transfer files, controller to gaming console, stuff like that. Z-Wave is meant to be a Bluetooth alternative for IoT. Again, not really associated with payment solutions. That leaves us with RFID and NFC. Both are very closely related, as they both use the same radio frequency of around 13 megahertz. But NFC is usually the one that you'll find on the smartphones and the smartwatches especially, but also supported by bank cards to do that tap and pay solution. Whereas RFID is more often used for things like access control cards and stuff like that to get into a building. So NFC is the appropriate option for a tap and pay solution. Even though they are both technically the same thing, at least from a radio frequency perspective, we would go for NFC here. Moving along. Next up, after deciding on the CPU for a desktop computer, what would be the most relevant details to check for a motherboard? Choose two things. So before we look at the options, let's just think about the scenario being given to us. We've settled on the CPU we want for a desktop computer. Then we need to look at the motherboard. This is a very, very common thing that is done, as generally most people care about what CPU they have, how much RAM, the graphics card if they have one. The motherboard is more of just how everything connects together. Obviously though, we do care about some motherboard features, but in general, the first thing is, okay, what kind of processor am I going to have, and what motherboard will support that best? So let's see what options matter. We've got the CPU socket form factor, the maximum RAM capacity, number of storage connectors, the PCIe features, like the number of connectors and the number of lanes, the chipset compatibility, and the type of storage connectors available. Now, all of these 6 options are valid things we would care about on our motherboard. But what we're looking at are the things that matter the most for the CPU and motherboard compatibility. So we're looking at CPU, motherboard compatibility. Now the RAM, that is not really a factor. The CPU socket though is. Now you might say, how can RAM not be a factor? Well, I'm not saying I don't care about how much RAM we're going to have, but it's not going to necessarily have a big influence over whether that CPU will work with that motherboard or not. What we care about when it comes to the maximum RAM capacity is, okay, how much RAM would I possibly need, and does this motherboard let me grow into that amount or possibly beyond that? It's not really something though that's going to affect the CPU motherboard choice. And also the CPU does in a way have an impact on how much RAM you can have, but more likely it's the motherboard limiting you. The number of storage connectors. This is motherboard to storage, so not that concerned. Plus, for the average person, you want at least one, possibly 2 to 3 connection options. PCI features? Kind of. I'm going to leave that in the play for now. But chipset compatibility, that feels good. Mainly because your CPU and motherboard chipset do work very closely together to create a functional system. And that feels like a good option. And then the storage connections, the types rather than the number of them. Again, if I'm not going to care about the number of storage connectors, I'm also not going to care about the type. We'll sort that out later. And plus, if we don't like the type of connectors we can always get an expansion card, assuming we've got enough PCI or PCIe connection points for expansion cards. Now, the PCIe features, that is a function of both CPU and motherboard, but we've already decided on the CPU, so that means we've already made choices with regards to the types of PCI features we're going to have as far as speeds and lanes and stuff like that is concerned. Chipset compatibility would be a bigger deal. I want to make sure the CPU fits in the motherboard and that the CPU and the chipset can communicate with each other to create a functional computer for all the other components to work nicely from. So that's my two choices there that make the biggest difference and would matter the most after picking a CPU. Moving along. Next up, taking administrative control of an Android phone is known as jailbreaking, sideloading, rooting, or flashing. Now, I'm hoping some of you thought about the answer straight away as soon as you heard me say that. But for those that you need to work it out, don't feel bad if you have to. Flashing and sideloading are not contenders here. Sideloading is where you install an app outside of the App Store. Flashing is normally where you're replacing the software on some sort of flash storage. So that leaves us with jailbreaking and rooting. Jailbreaking is taking admin control of iOS, and rooting is taking admin control of Android. It's the same kind of operation, but because it's two different OSs, we get two different terms here. So rooting is the better one. For those of you that are wondering why, Android being based on Linux, root is the admin user in Linux. And jailbreaking in iOS is actually kind of a good name because Apple does keep you in a enclosed ecosystem. So you're kind of breaking out of Apple's jail. So let's move along to something else. Next up, the purpose of thermal paste is to improve heat transfer from a chip to a heatsink. True or false? So yes, you do sometimes get some true and false questions in the CompTIA exams, and those can be quite scary. This one seems pretty decent though. Let's have a look at it. Thermal paste to improve heat transfer from a chip to a heatsink. Single statement, and it is true. It is the purpose of thermal paste. Cool, nice and straightforward. Next, which of the following best describes the function of a DNS server? So this is testing how well you know your network servers and services. So let's see. Hosting web pages and web apps. Hosting personal mailboxes and calendars. Providing IP address information to clients and resolving names to IP addresses. Well, let's quickly work it out both ways. DNS resolves names to IP addresses, and that is literally option D. A DNS server generally does not host a web page or web applications. Now, some of you might call me out on this, but that's more than likely an option of the DNS service you have installed to have a DNS server. Some might host a web service so you can log in and graphically administrate that server, but it's not a requirement or a prerequisite. Hosting mailboxes and calendars, that's not the purpose of DNS. That's an email service job. And providing IP address information to clients, that sounds like DHCP, not DNS. So you could either go straight to the answer you recognize, DNS resolves names to IPs, or you could eliminate. No, that sounds like a web server. That sounds like a mailbox server. That sounds like a DHCP server. Well, that must be the option. The final one being D. Moving along. Next up, which of the following would best describe the use of IaaS, or Infrastructure as a Service? So our options are hosting a virtual server. That actually sounds quite good already. But even if we do have a good first option, let's make sure we're not happier with one of the other ones. Option B is application development and hosting. You could do that with Infrastructure as a Service. But you could also do it with Platform as a Service as well. C, hosting of communication services such as email. Again, I could do that with Infrastructure as a Service, but I can also do that with a Software as a Service solution. And then performing off-site backups. So straight away, I'm going to eliminate B and C. The reason why is this can be PAAS as well. And communication services like email, that can easily be a Software as a Service option. So they're not exclusively Infrastructure as a Service. Running a virtual server though, yeah. I mean, look, that virtual server could be used for anything. But it's more of an IaaS thing. Offsite backups, yes, you could use Infrastructure as a Service for offsite backups, but this would probably be better as storage as a service, which technically falls under XaaS. So, yes, I could, but let's be honest, hosting a virtual server does best describe Infrastructure as a Service. So that's our better choice there. Moving to the next question. All right, where in a laptop is the wireless NIC most likely to be located? I'll let you think about where you'd find the wireless network card on a laptop, but here are our options. Option A, mounted to the motherboard. Option B, underneath the battery. Option C, near the touchpad. And option D, in the bezel of the screen. Now, if you were immediately attracted to the bezel of the screen, that's a no. They said the network card, not the antenna. And the antenna is what you'd likely find in the bezel of the screen. We're looking for the NIC, not the little wires that plug into it and go around the bezel of the screen. Now, finding it near the touchpad, I wouldn't be too keen if I was designing a laptop to put it near the touchpad, as that's a part of the laptop body you're likely to experience a lot of impact and nudges and taps. So, probably not there. Underneath the battery, I wouldn't put it underneath the battery. In fact, you normally try and keep as few circuit boards near the battery as possible in case the battery swells or anything like that. Usually your network card for the wireless is mounted to the motherboard, so you can swap it out, assuming it is a replaceable NIC. If it is not a replaceable NIC, then it's going to be part of the motherboard, in which case then this question is pointless, because then it would be, oh well, where would you find the motherboard in a laptop inside of it? So yeah, best option, mounted to the motherboard. One of those questions testing your knowledge of hardware servicing of laptops. But the trick to that was they were asking for the network card, not the antenna. So watch out. They use their words very specifically in the exam and very precisely. So just take a moment, read through it carefully, you'll be fine. Which of the following CAT standards for twisted pair Ethernet cables is unable to achieve speeds of 1 gigabit per second or higher? So again, another networking question, checking do you know your physical networking thingies. So we've got Cat6 cabling, Cat5e, Cat5, and Cat7. So let's list the speeds if you can't remember them. Cat6, you're looking at a solid 1 gigabit per second. So we're looking for something that can't get to 1 gigabit per second. That kills that. Cat5e is 100 megs to 1 gigabit per second. Although if I'm being perfectly honest, it doesn't do 1 gigabit per second very well. But hey, it does go close to it. So near enough is good enough here. Cat5 on the other hand, the one without the E, that is a 100 megabit per second hard stop. Done. And then Cat7, you're looking at a solid 10 gigabits per second, leaving us with Cat5. Remember, we're looking for things that could not achieve 1 gigabit per second or higher, and that's Cat5. Next up, which of the following motherboard components would be needed to utilize software-driven full disk encryption? So, motherboard that supports security. Let's see what options we have here. We've got the chipset, we've got TPM, we've got VRM, and we've got drive controller. Okay, so they've gone very vague on things here, but I'm hoping that you remember hearing something about a full disk encryption called BitLocker. This is a Microsoft service. Now, BitLocker has two modes of operation. Password mode, where you type a password in to seed the decryption key, and that will obviously then decrypt the hard drive. The other mode is TPM mode. What do you know? TPM is one of the options. It's a security chip on the motherboard that helps with things like storing a disk encryption key so that the hard drive can decrypt easily and automatically as long as it stays plugged into the same motherboard. If you transplant that hard drive to another motherboard, it goes, don't trust you, and refuses to decrypt unless you give it the 48-character recovery password, which you don't get to choose, by the way, but BitLocker generates it when you turn it on. Now, if you wanted to do a process of elimination, well, we can do that. VRM, or voltage regulator module, that's to do with power. So let's eliminate that. Chipset, this is more about coordinating components. Getting the CPU to work together with the RAM, the storage controller, the PCIe bus, etc. So, chipset's a little bit too broad spectrum to focus on something like encryption. Drive controller, maybe. You might have gone for that because they did say full disk encryption, drive controller, natural choice, but that was the red herring. That was there to distract you. The reason why it's not the drive controller is the drive controller's job is to make sure the storage media works and is accessible. The TPM module, on the other hand, is there to make sure the disk is secure and safe, which is kind of the opposite. So the TPM module is the better choice, but it is relying on that you know what BitLocker is. Now, if you didn't come across BitLocker while you were preparing for A+ Core 1, that's okay. What's normally encouraged is that you study A+ Core 1 and Core 2, and then when you're prepping for the exam, you focus more on your Core 1 topics, with the Core 2 floating in the back of your head. And the same is true when you do Core 2. Focus on your Core 2 topics, but don't forget about what you learned in Core 1. Ideally, you should do both A+ courses before attempting either of the two exams. At least that's the current advice. Several years ago and several versions ago, you could do the first course, the first exam, the second course, the second exam separately, and you could be okay. But now we've got a little bit of a crossover between some of the topics, which is fair and reasonable, because technology is like that now. You can't just put it in a nice little bucket or a nice little box at the moment. Anyway, let's move on to another question. Next, a video editor would like to purchase a new computer. Which of the following should they focus on as a feature that will improve performance? So let's see what they're going to list here, and then we'll worry about what's the right or wrong option. So they're listing CPU, GPU, RAM, and storage. 4 key components, but they're not going into details about which kind of component. Basically what they're looking at is, given a certain budget, what should the person try and favor to spend more of their budget on compared to other components? Now, they are speaking about a video editor. Now, in general, video editing tends to favor GPU performance. Now, that does depend on the video editing software you're using, but overall, it generally does favor GPU. So, GPU is listed there. RAM-wise, generally, I haven't seen most computers have too much of a distinction after a certain amount of RAM. Usually around about the 8 to 16 gigabytes of RAM, you're not going to see much of an improvement. Storage-wise, yeah, storage would be kind of useful, but nothing that couldn't be supplemented with a pretty decent external hard drive or a nice fast NAS solution. CPU, not really. There are some video editing tools out there that do favor CPU performance, but not that many. I mean, the one I use does favor CPU over GPU performance, but only for certain video formats. So GPU generally would be better for a professional video editor, especially if they're using anything from the Adobe suite. Otherwise though, that should be a pretty solid option, and probably the option CompTIA would most prefer us to choose anyway, regardless of your real experiences. Which is a bit of advice here. If I was relying purely off my experience from video editing for YouTube, I would have gone CPU considering the tools I'm using and the video formats and encoding I'm using. However, you got to be careful with CompTIA exams. They don't want you to use too much of your experience. They sometimes want you to choose their preferred answer. And this might be one of those cases. Either way though, let's move on to another question. Next up, a user asks a technician for advice on what kind of storage to get to back up files for their family. This will include important documents, photos, videos, and similar files. What would be the best option for this user? They might be saying, hang on, this is not for the workplace. Why do I have to deal with this? You work in IT, you're going to get the occasional user who likes you and comes to you for some tech advice in their life. Be prepared for this. And please, please, please do me a favor. You might think, oh, come on, this is basic and easy. It's not for the average user. I promise you there is something that the users at work do that's basic and easy for them, but is a nightmare for you to do. So be patient and tolerant. We all have our expertises and our knowledge spaces. Work with your users. Okay, enough preaching about good etiquette and professionalism. Let's look at the options. So first up, a 4TB internal HDD, a 128GB NAS. Very weird size for a NAS, but anyway. A 512GB external SSD and a 4TB external HDD. So first of all, let's relook at that use case. They're looking at doing backups for their files and their family members' files. Photos, videos, those are quite big in terms of file sizes. Documents, not too big, but obviously crucial. And other similar things. Maybe music, I don't know. So let's see. First thing we're going to want is capacity. And straight away, that makes that suck. Because 128 gigs is not going to get you very far. You probably get way more storage if you decided to use like the free amount of storage you get with Microsoft OneDrive. Alright, moving along. A 4TB internal disk. Internal. No. The reason why I want to scratch that out, I don't know what computer the user has at home. I don't know how comfortable they are with opening a computer up and adding a new hard drive and then making that hard drive shared across the network. Not too mad about that. Externals, however, I like those for this because it can be very easy for the user to buy an external drive, plug it into their computer, back up their files, go to their spouse's computer, back up their files. If they've got kids, go to their kids' computers, back up their files. Visit their parents, plug it into their parents' computer, back up their files. Yeah, I could see an external being great for that. Simple, easy, intuitive, works wonders. Now, the SSD does hold some appeal to do it quickly, but we're looking at capacity here. And 512 gigs is not a lot. 4 terabytes sounds way better. So I'd go with that recommendation for the user. A 4 terabyte external drive. Yeah, it's a bit pricey, but you will probably be able to back up all of the major things in a personal setting like that. And then just stick that external hard drive somewhere safe, and you've got a backup. Fantastic. Now, there are other options. You could tell the user to look at a cloud storage service maybe. But here's the thing. It's not an option. Sometimes you're going to get these questions in the exam where you think, nah, but that would be a way better option. Even though, yes, it might be a way better option, if it's not listed here in the exam, you go with what is shown to you. Pick the options that CompTIA puts forward to you. And if anything, it does at least have one real world analogy. And that is that the user is going to come with constraints for you, like, oh, that's a bit expensive, or something like that. Anyway, that's that question done. So, that was 50 questions to help you prepare for this exam. Hopefully it helps you get more prepared and ready for this exam, and please let me know how it goes. And if you have any friends, family members, colleagues, or peers that are interested in doing the CompTIA A+ certification, don't be afraid to share these videos with them. Otherwise though, I'd like to say thank you for watching, and I'll catch you in the next video.